Welcome to ChurchPulse Weekly. I'm Carey Newhoff, and I'm joined today by Barna's Savannah Kimberlin. Welcome, Savannah. Welcome back. And we're going to bring on John Mark Comer in just a few minutes. One of my favorite leaders these days, and just a great leader to have a conversation with, to follow. His writing has just helped so many people, as well as his preaching and his thinking. But first, we're going to dive into some data. So here we are, a year into the pandemic. Again, as we were joking before we started, depending on where you live, right? There's some places where it's like, what? Didn't that end a year ago? And others are like, no, we still can't eat in a restaurant. Like, come on, give me a break. And so we're in a various state of confusion. But one of the things that has really marked, I think, our last year as leaders is every leader I talk to says they've let in more tension. People are more animated. They're more angry. They're more vocal, they're frustrated, they're agitated. I think the hate mail has probably gone, to record levels. And we're going to touch on that a little bit in our conversation with John Mark in a few moments. But you've been collecting some data over at Barna on how leaders are leading in tense times. And I'd love for you to be able to share that with us.
Yeah, thanks, Carey. Absolutely. It is certainly a tense time. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. And it's interesting as we're talking about leading communities right now, and what does it look like to be a peaceful presence in a moment that feels really anxious? We see that a lot of leaders are starting to reimagine how they can engage their communities. They're trying to innovate. They're trying to be, they're seeing a lot of gaps in their engagement with their communities. And recently, I know we've already shared this data, but we asked pastors in January of 2021 what their top concerns were going into the new year, and community outreach was number one. So being a presence in the community is a top concern. So with that in mind, we've been wanting to gauge how how church leaders are seeing their roles in this moment. And it's interesting. When we ask, okay, pastor, do you think that your community views you as a trustworthy source of wisdom? Like, do you think that's how they view you? Only 1 in 5 are confident in saying yes. And a solid 17% say no. And furthermore, and this is really interesting, especially considering our guest today is John Mark, for the more post-Christian regions like the Northeast, as we would anticipate, that number jumps up. So in the Northeast, 29% of leaders say, like, no, my community does not view me as a source of truth or as a trustworthy source of wisdom. So it's a tense moment for so many.
That's really interesting, because one of the challenges I had in ministry for decades was the more time went on, the less willing I was to want to tell people when I first met them that I was a pastor. And that wasn't necessarily, sometimes it was because of what I was doing or whatever in the community, but kind of it's just like this taint. It's like, I don't think we have a very good reputation anymore in the community. So it would be really interesting, to figure out whether that's like, oh no, that's because of our church, or that's just because, hey, this is the moment we're in, and religious leaders are not viewed with the same affection and respect that they were generations ago. Okay, fascinating data. So we're all a little insecure about how we're going to be received in the community. You said you had something else as well. So what else have you discovered?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about tension and tense climates, we have to talk about the political climate of today and what on earth it means. Like, what does it even mean to be a leader right now in a church, and to be a pastor and to lead our people through the political climate of today? And so we asked pastors how they were doing in that area, and are they confident in their leadership in that area? And only 1 in 3 pastors today feel like they're viewed as reliable leaders on this topic. So there's definitely a disconnect when we're talking about pastors serving the people of God, especially in the climate of today.
Yeah, well, we see some uncertainty, and I think that's appropriate. I remember one of the things David and I talked about early on last year when we were polling leaders is there was almost an overconfidence. There was almost like, no, I'm doing great. And I think time has caught up with us, and reality has caught up with us. And I think, as hard as this is, it can be a really good thing as a leader to kind of have a realistic assessment of how you're doing. And that's super helpful. Well, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the Leading Hybrid Church Barna collab that Barna is offering. So we have a promotion on right now for church leaders because I think hybrid church is the future. I was talking to one leader on the weekend who said, you know what? He talked to a leader, and this is almost like telephone, so you got to be careful, who was really looking forward to never having to stream a service again. And I'm like, sorry, what millennium are you living in? I'm not sure. Anyway, but hybrid church, I think, is the future. It's a 6-week learning cohort designed to help you figure out how to lead your church more effectively in both digital and in-person spaces. So anything more about collabs? Like, what is that? Is that like on demand, or you're actually learning with other people, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we're really pumped. We've developed this 6-week cohort, and we're taking different topics and leading church leaders through processing Barna data, all the way from seeing clearly and understanding a certain topic or a specific issue clearly, all the way through developing a ministry plan for their specific context. So yes, so for the hybrid cohort, we will be leading pastors and church staffs and teams through processing what does the future look like as it pertains to hybrid ministry. So we're going to establish up front, and we've talked about this on this podcast and elsewhere as well, that the future is most likely going to be hybrid because that's what the people want, right? So we know that that's what people are wanting. But when we say hybrid ministry, what is that actually going to look like? Like, does that mean that all of my small groups will always be on Zoom? Does that mean that I need to have 2 different prayer ministries as a leader, one online and one in person, to pray for people and their prayer requests during services? You know, like, what does it actually mean to lead a hybrid church? So we're going to be unpacking that together and processing what our future can be together.
No, that's great. So, hey, if you want more, go to barna.com/collab and use the promo code ChurchPulse15, ChurchPulse15. That'll get you a bit of a discount. Savannah, look forward to next time. Thank you so much for joining us this week. And John Mark, it is great to have you back on Church Pulse Weekly. I always look forward to our conversations together. And here we are at about the year mark. And I want to start here because I think so many leaders have already read, myself included, your book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. It's been such a gift to so many of us. And this has been such a weird year. Like, it's been a big reset for me. I think my future is going to look really, really different. And it's brought a unique set of stressors. So I would just love for you to comment on, a year in where you have felt the impact most personally as a leader, or as a husband, a father, like any of those categories. Where have you felt challenged the most, or the most joy in the last year?
Yeah, well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on. I was chatting to my therapist recently about burnout, and I'm sure you've done some podcasts recently on just the epidemic of burnout, not just for pastors, but for people across the West. The Economist or Harvard Business Review had a great article on it last week. Just extraordinary numbers of burnout that were already there, but were accelerated by COVID. And, burnout is a function, the experts say, of high responsibility, low control, and low reward. So if you think of those 3 levers of responsibility, control, and reward, normally a pastor has high responsibility, low control, because, we don't make widgets. We attempt to pastor people. And so they're not under our control. We lead, we set an example, we invite, we do our best to woo and even to discipline, but we can't, nor should we, control people. And we're trying to get them to do stuff that is hard voluntarily, and by the way, pay our salary along the way, So we always have low control, but normally there's high reward. There's this sense of we're with people, we're serving people, we have meaning and purpose in our work. And there's a lot of criticism, but there's a lot of gratitude. But that reward has kind of plummeted for most of us as we've been staring into a camera and answering angry emails because we're not political enough, or we're too political, or we're the wrong kind of political, or whatever it is, So I definitely think that's a massive challenge for anybody, acute for pastors. And it's really hard, some of the work that I've done around hurry, around spiritual disciplines, around Sabbath and slowing, all of which is still very much in my rule of life. But it's very hard because of just the volatility of the last year and the reactivity in the political sphere. I just grew increasingly frustrated and a little resentful because it just felt like somebody else on the other side of the country was setting the agenda for my leadership. And there was so much chaos at the socio-political level. It was really hard to have any function of like planning or rhythm or, so I held to my morning prayer and my Sabbath. But overall, it was really, really hard to live in that kind of rule of life, rhythm of life, the right pace, because that requires planning. And I think we Westerners have realized how much of planning is a function of middle-class prosperity and stability and culture. And once that is gone, planning, as it is in many other corners of the world, is a little bit of an exercise in futility or comedy. So I've been reading a lot of the mystics and what they say about holy uncertainty and trying to just live with a high kind of capacity. As a leader, it's hard because I'm a planner, it's part of my job. But trying to learn to really live with a high capacity just for the unknown, for a lack of control over outcomes and over people, and just trying to stay faithful. So I think that's been some of the greatest challenges have been the workload, the exhaustion, the sense of, man, this is not a fun job at all. And, part of that's due to a lot of the criticism.
I'm curious, reading the mystics, what are the mystics saying about holy uncertainty and the unknown? What are you drawing from them?
Well, a lot of the mystics, a lot of Christian psychologists, a lot of the church fathers and mothers, desert fathers and mothers, would all kind of in their own language say that the spiritual journey is essentially a journey, the Christian spiritual journey is essentially one from fear to love. And most psychologists attempt to categorize emotions, and there's the classic 7 or 9 major emotions, the kind of survival emotions of anger, fear, shame, whatever. But a number of psychologists basically argue there are just 2 primary emotions, fear and love. And that makes me, of course, go to 1 John in my mind, how perfect, there is no fear in love, and perfect love casts out fear. And fear, when you start to unpack the inner architecture of it, is the major blockage we all have to love. Because as long as we're fearful of something, we need the world to go a certain way. We need people to act toward us in a certain way in order to act toward them in love. And as long as we need people to act in a certain way or life to go in a certain way, we'll always sabotage our growth into people of faith and hope and love. So what the mystics would say is that at the root of fear is a need for control. You see this in Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount around worry and money. Rooted at the base of that is we want to feel in control rather than abandoning ourselves to, what Jean-Pierre de Caussade called divine providence. And I don't mean that in a theological determinist sense, but just abandon ourselves to the love of God and the flow of Trinitarian love through us. And so they would say that the root issue of our discipleship is learning to move from kind of a grasping for control that's rooted in fear, which is honestly probably the major inner problem I face as a leader, constant temptation every single day and so many decisions. If I trace it down to the root, it's I'm scared and I'm grasping for control. And whenever I lead from that posture, I inevitably screw up and make mistakes and hurt people. And so it's moving off of that to just a grateful receiving of what comes. And that doesn't mean that we're not active and responsible and proactive and all of those things. That kind of goes without saying for leaders. But and the mystics would say that was the main reason that God takes us through the dark night of the soul, these, whatever you want to call that, these seasons in our prayer life where we feel dry and arid and we don't sense God's presence, and God feels a little bit more like absence than presence. And if you haven't been through that, you likely will at some point. Most people all go through these seasons where we just feel almost a sense of abandonment from the presence of God. And they would say that one of the main things God is teaching you through that is that you're not in control of God. You're not in control of your spiritual formation or your transformation. You're not in control of your relationship with God. And you're not nearly as in control of your life as you think you are. I read a great psychological survey that said the average Westerner has 15% of the control over their life they think they do. And hence why everybody's freaking out. And what the last year I think has done is expose the illusion that we're more in control of our life than we actually are, and give all of us an invitation either to freak out and rant or to actually begin to accept reality and move to a place of love, trusting love, So maybe I'm talking a little too psychological or spiritual,
No,
but
no, no.
I really think this is at the root of leadership right now.
I do too, and that's why I want to go a little bit deeper. We will get into some, very practical things before we wrap up our time together. But I just came off of a week off, like we were talking about as we were getting ready for this, and my burnout was 15 years ago now, which I'm thankful I haven't burned out again. Never want to go back there, but have been a student of that, and really appreciate your thinking and contribution to the field. But this is a week off where, because I broke my hand a month and a half ago, it's still recovering, but like I couldn't go skiing. I couldn't go cross country skiing because I could re-injure it. So basically I could sit in this condo, because I've been in the same time zone for about a year now. And I could sit in this condo with my wife that we rented, which is different than sitting in our house, right? When you're still in semi-lockdown. And really all we could do was go walking or snowshoeing. That was it. And eat and relax. And I'd totally cleared the calendar. And I was shocked at how tired I was, because I'm not traveling anymore. I'm not doing anything. I was sleeping like 10 or 11 hours a day. And I'm like, oh, this is a discovery. And then this unsettledness around the lack of activity. And I was thinking along the lines of the mystics, that my whole life could be explained by fear and greed. Either I'm afraid of something and trying to control it, or I want more, not necessarily money, but like, I want more traction. I want more of this. I want more. And so it was very, very unsettling. And it was really interesting at this point of time, a year into the pandemic, to have that kind of window into the soul. It got better as the day went on, as the week went on. And I thought, oh, I wish I had another week, because I'd like to see what's at the bottom of this. But, here we are back again. Any thoughts? Have you had moments to reflect more deeply, or has it just been like rattle, 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 rattle for the last year? I'm curious, because you were finding those spaces before the pandemic. And what I'm concerned, the reason I'm asking the question and sharing the experience is, I think so many leaders are running so fast right now that if they stopped for long enough, it'd be a little bit frightening to discover what was there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why all the Desert Fathers and mothers and the tradition that comes from them, they literally went out to the desert. Because when you're in that place, whether it's a desert or a condo or whatever, maybe the late modern
might as well have been the
Canadian
desert. We didn't have a lot of options
in COVID. The desert teaches by stripping away. And so when you go out, it's interesting. If you read like the ancients, the church fathers and mothers, they don't view silence and solitude or desert or even times of rest as like a little me time to like just catch a little break. And, it's like that Henry Nouwen line, solitude is not a private therapeutic place. It is the place of conversion. He would call it the furnace of our transformation. So their template wasn't like, I'm going to chill and relax and get a little me time. Their template was Jesus in Matthew 4, going into the desert to fight Satan. And they would say that you go into the desert because there you can't hide from yourself, and you can't hide from, they would say, the devil in your mind. And that's how they, Evagrius Ponticus and many others, interpreted Matthew 4, was that the battle of the desert is essentially a war in your mind stream with the devil's lies and combating it with truth, and facing the deepest temptations and the most subtle and insidious temptations to your life and to your ministry. So I think those times are more crucial now than ever before. I've been thinking a lot. So yes, my life has been exhausting for a year, but I have been carving out times for rest, for Sabbath. My morning times have gotten of quiet and processing are longer, not shorter, because I just have so much to process right now. What I've not been able to do is get a nice long break, because the volatility of the moment has made, normally like in my annual rhythm, the summer before COVID, I take a 3-week break, and I'm literally offline for 3 weeks. No text message, not much any social media. I mean, no social media or email or anything. I'm not even on my phone at all. I am like offline for 3 weeks. And I haven't been able to get that just due to the responsibility and demands of COVID. But I've been able to get shorter times, and I want to get one of those really soon. They're on the schedule for 2021. But I've been thinking a lot about a sports concept, and I'm not an athlete kind of guy, but I'm really interested in sports psychology, and I think there's a lot of analogous ideas for leadership and athleticism. Obviously, in the New Testament, it's a major metaphor. But in sports, there's this growing concept of load management that, as I understand it, kind of started in baseball with pitchers, and now has spread to the NBA and is very controversial. And as I understand it, the basic idea is that the more integral that you are to the team, if you're the pitcher or whatever, actually the more you need to rest, not the less. And I read this great book on an Olympian cyclist, and the trainer had this great line. He said, what separates elite athletes at the Olympic level is not how hard they train, it's how hard they rest. Because he said everybody at that level is like crazy type A trainers. What really separates like the gold medalists from the others is how seriously they take their rest, their recuperation, their whole body, their soul, their spirit. And so I think there's an insidious lie that the more leadership we have, the more pastoral responsibility we have, the more we need to be active doing stuff. And I actually wonder if the invitation is the opposite. And I do think you could argue this from the life of Jesus, that the more in demand he became, the more he would slip away and disappear into the desert to pray and to get alone. Is that, the Luke 5 line, Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. So I think that's imperative that could be said of us as leaders, that we often withdraw to lonely places and pray.
I remember the first time, I really saw what the text was saying, which was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, because as a kid, you kind of like, oh yeah, well, he was done all the healing. And then one day it just hit me. No, he wasn't done healing. He was just done. Yeah. It's like, sorry, guys, I'm finished. I'm going to disappear. And off into the wilderness he goes to pray. And he's almost antisocial in the way that he does it, which is interesting. So for the leaders who are listening, who are exhausting, and it's funny, I interviewed recently Rob Pelinka, the Lakers GM, and one of the questions I had for him was on rest. And he said that like some of his top athletes will spend $1 million a year, which, I mean, they have that kind of money to rest, to get therapy. It's what happens off the court, because on the court, you have a few moves and everything, but it is all that off season that actually makes them that amazing. And I think you said Kobe, Kobe used to sleep a lot, but LeBron James would be, sometimes 10, 12 hours a night of just rest. So he could explode on the court. So for leaders who are like, I hear you, John Mark, give me a couple of disciplines I could start this week. Like, is there one thing I could do? Like, do you have a place for them to start if they feel like they're going under or they're drowning? Like, what has been a lifesaver for you?
Well, two things that are really helpful for me at a pastoral level. One is just, I think this is Andy Crouch's language, but just parenting your phone. So, if you have kids of a certain age, my kids are getting older, so this is no longer true. But when they were younger, if you're a semi-wise parent, your kids go to bed before you go to bed, and they get up after you get up. So you can have a little time in the evening to kind of decompress and spend time with your spouse. And so you can have time in the morning to like gear up for the marathon ahead. And I think something like that for the phone is really good. I think it's imperative that we all have some kind of a digital rule of life, whether you call it that or not. So I have about a dozen kind of digital practices, one of which is my phone, quote, goes to bed at 8:30 p.m., meaning at 8:30, the phone is off, it's closed, it's on a charger in a closet in the hallway, out of mind, out of sight. And I don't look at it, with a few exceptions. Every day is a little bit different. Today was a little bit different. We're starting earlier today, but till 9:30 the following morning. So that gives me about 3.5 hours every morning to pray, do some contemplative practices, and then I read scripture, and then I read, and then do a little, any kind of deep work as far as sermon or any strategic stuff I need to do. So I know that I have a 3 or 4 hour block every morning where there's no phone. Every time I open my phone, there's bad stuff that happens at some level. Not every time, but the phone is like the harbinger of death, And so that discipline for me is absolutely essential. The second one that for me, has been harder this year, but at a pastoral level has been really helpful, is just some kind of a fixed hour schedule, because, or kind of a set schedule that, my meetings go into each week, and even having 1 or 2 meetings that are open for crisis. The problem with the pastoral role is it's kind of like one crisis. It requires like organizational leadership, which is strategic, long range planning, short range planning. It requires the creative process of preaching. If you do preaching, requires a ton of self-discipline, disciplines of reading, disciplines of study, disciplines of prayer, disciplines of creatives, like the most creative people are actually some of the most disciplined people contrary to the stereotypes. But the pastoral role is basically responding to a steady stream of crises. And so if you're not careful, your whole life can become tyranny of the urgent. I could literally just sit in front of my computer, answer emails, and deal with problems 12 hours a day if I let it carry me away. So having some kind of like fixed schedule where I'm like, these are my meeting blocks for the weeks. These are the times when I'm blocked out. I'm busy. I have a meeting here, even if the meeting is like with my sermon prep or whatever.
Right.
And having some blocks in there that are like always open for last minute people that need to get a cup of coffee with you, or like the one I had yesterday where, due to bereavement, the loss of somebody. So I think those 2 simple practices for me have made a lot of a difference. But again, I don't think there's like a quick fix. Like leadership is a form of suffering. I think if you
I
had
find every time you think you got it fixed, there's like a new level of complexity. And then it's like, well, let's reboot the system, right? What would you say to leaders? Because I really understand. I counted up my inboxes in preparation for a book I've been working on, and I have 11, which is almost depressing, between email and social media and so on. So leaders and pastors, it doesn't matter. You can lead a church of 50 people. You feel like you're on 24/7. So there must be, in all the inboxes you have, some people you leave hanging, some people that don't get a response. What would you say to the pastor who says, I can't put my phone to bed at 8:30 and pick it up 13 hours later because I have all these people who have needs and they want an immediate response? How have you navigated those boundaries personally, John Mark? Like, how do you get back to the people who are like, I texted you at 8:00 last night and you didn't get back to me until lunch today. Like, do you face that, or what does that look like? Because I think that's a very real world problem for a lot of leaders.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first off, you have to recognize there's no world where you can please everybody. So you're just talking about, like, seriously, it does not exist. That's a mythical idea that you're going to be able to please every single person's expectations on you for communication or time or pastoral availability. Absolute mythical idea. So as long as your strategy is like whack-a-mole of trying to like meet everybody's pastoral expectations, you literally, not only will you burn out, you will fail and burn out, which is part of where burnout comes from, because you're working so hard and you're not meeting this unrealistic goal that you're trying to aim for. So I just work really hard to clarify expectations. So it's very important to me that I try to respond to every text, every email, everything I can. But I just try to have clear expectations. So this is, I'm kind of famous for this, and people mock me and some people hate me, and that's not hate me, but are mad at me about it, but I'm fine with that. But like for email, I just do email once a week, and there's an auto reply that is on my email 24/7 that says, due to my commitment to Sabbath and deep work and the responsibilities of my job and family, I only do email on Monday afternoons. I promise to respond to this then. And I respond to every single email. I go to inbox 0 every single Monday. But in the meantime, you're just not going to hear from me. Text messages, I attempt to do text messages bundling at 11 and 5 p.m. each day. I'll sit down, I'll answer every single text message, and then I will do my best to not look at it until 5 p.m. that day, because I have so much work to do. So some of it for me is just about clarifying expectations and being upfront. And people will come to you with all of their expectations. They will moralize those expectations, and they will expect you to live the way that they live. And that's just a recipe for constant friction. And there literally is no possible way to meet everybody's expectations. And so one of the first invitations, I think, to leadership growth is, and that really has been, honestly, I think the biggest thing that God's done in me as a leader this year, and is doing, though I have a long ways to go. I didn't realize the degree prior to this year. I was blind, I think, to a part of my shadow. I did not realize just how in bondage I was emotionally to the fear of other people's opinion of me, and other people's expectations on me, and other people's moral judgments on me. And I did not realize how much I was living in captivity to that and how much it was sabotaging my soul, my family life and marriage, and honestly, my leadership, my spiritual authority. And the gift of the last year is the same thing as the trauma of the last year. It is literally impossible to lead through a year like 2020 and now 2021 and not have a whole bunch of people upset about you, just because of the broad range of opinion issues, whether it be on social distancing and masks and should you regather and in what capacity, or all the political stuff and the polarization and right and left, and some people that want you to be political, others that don't, some people that want you to be right, others that want you to be left, others that want you to shut up, others that say if you shut up, you're horrible, So like there's literally no, you are darned if you do, darned if you don't. And there's a gift in there, it's very hard to lead people that you need something from, because you'll never be able to lead them forward. You will become a chaplain rather than a pastor. And I don't mean that to disparage the role of a chaplain. I mean that in the kind of antidotal kind of sense, where you're there to kind of baptize what they're already doing and just to kind of help them feel good and help them along the way. That's not our role. Our role is to labor until Christ is formed into people. Galatians, that's Paul's philosophy of pastoring. So it's very hard to do that when you need something from people, whether you need money from them, you need approval from them, you need support from them, you need agreement from them. It's very hard to actually lead them into, what Scott McKnight calls Christoformity or Christ-likeness. And so I really feel one of the gifts of the last year for me, though it's been, it feels like peeling my skin off. It's been so emotionally hard, has been just God lovingly stripping me of my fear of what other people think of me. And, it's interesting. I've been reading Evagrius of Ponticus a lot lately, 4th century desert father, brilliant mind. And his work became the basis for what we now call the 7 deadly sins. And he was the one that did a lot of work around vainglory. And it's really interesting. I hear that word vainglory and I think of kind of celeb pastor, glamour, selfie on Instagram. And that's actually, that was in his world. And that's not what he meant by it. He meant, and he said vainglory was the greatest temptation for the spiritually mature. And it was the desire to be perceived as spiritually mature and good and wise and calm and godly and, Christ-like. And, it's so true. John Ortberg said to me a couple months ago, he said, your reputation isn't who you are, it's who people think you are. And so it's really easy for vainglory to slip into that. And so, I feel like Jesus has been lovingly purifying me of vainglory over the last year.
What was the catalyst for that kind of self-revelation, that kind of insight? Was there an incident? Was it something you were reading? Was it the pandemic? Like what brought you to that? This is the current work God is doing in me.
That would have been right through the early couple months of the pandemic. And then when George Floyd was killed and our city basically erupted, we had 100+ straight days, not of protests, but of riots and violence. And in that world, in particular online, the level of vitriol and anger and hate spewed from so many people was extraordinary. The level of kind of projection and transference at a psychological level onto me as a white male leader in the public space was extraordinary. And I was racked by fear. Like my body was literally like in full-on fight or flight. I'm going to try to do a bunch of medical stuff this year to try to like kind of reset my nervous system, because it really damaged even my body. I think the level of fear that I was living with was extraordinary. And I have like great disciplines of Sabbath and morning prayer. I do contemplative prayer every morning. I, sleep 8 to 9 hours a night. I do cardiovascular exercise 5 days a week. Like I really try to cut down on sugar. Like I have good disciplines to help mitigate fear on a bodily level. And I have a great therapist and great community, but man, my fear was just like pulsing through my body. And, fear is one of the main ways that God reveals to us our attachments. And so I began to realize, what am I so scared of? And that's where fear is such a gift, because fear has almost a direct line to your attachments or idols, if you want to use Calvinistic language, or whatever it is that has become a de facto God. Robert Mulholland calls them our trust structures. And for leaders, this is the greatest danger for us, because we can have perfectly orthodox theology, we can live moral lives, we can even lead with wisdom and acumen, but we can have hearts that are like utterly wrapped up in trust structures and attachments and idols that do not go by the name of Jesus. And they just rob us of all peace. And they rob us of the courage to do the right thing as leaders. So honestly, it was my fear that came about as the result of the kind of anger and criticism of the last year.
And if we can, because I think you're reading every church leader's mail right now. This is the conversation I keep having with leaders who are going, and again, it's irrespective of size, influence, just every pastor is like, I'm getting ripped apart. I'm getting torn apart. So you were being criticized for what you were saying, what you weren't saying. And can you double click on how you responded publicly? Because I think we're getting an insight into the private side of what that did to you. But like, what would you say to your critics? Or did you finally just throw your hands up and give up? Or how did you handle that?
Well, I'm happy to tell you some of the things I did, but I don't know that I handled it well. I'm not even sure that handling it well is really an option. But
I don't know how you do that. Yeah.
So a couple of things. One is I was really inspired by, this is going to sound kind of pretentious, and I don't mean it that way, but by the narratives in Acts when Paul tries to respond to the mob, and the wiser voices around him stop him. And the few times that they can't stop him, like in Jerusalem, it's an utter disaster. And I don't think that the mob wants to hear you, and definitely don't want to have a thoughtful, and this is one of the great tragedies of the social media era, is it is eradicating an entire generation's capacity for slow, kind, thoughtful, nuanced, in-depth debate and conversation.
Yes.
So, which makes people form beliefs that are truncated, are not just ideological, but are truncated, are based on like little aphorisms that are thin and shallow. People have actually done the hard work to reach those. They're based on kind of herd mob mentality. They receive them from the mob rather than actually cultivating them through critical thinking and experience. They require no sacrifice, no commitment to hold these beliefs. You're just kind of getting swept up. And as a result, one of the sad things is because they're so truncated, people that disagree often will throw the baby out with the bathwater. So in particular, some of the language around racial justice, when it's not held in a thoughtful, intelligent, honest, nuanced way, it enables people that are entrenched on the right or the other side of the culture wars, to just gives them more ammo to throw back, rather than actually forcing them to engage reality. And so I think it's one of the great schemes of the enemy. So all that to say, I would speak about it only in long form. So I went off social media for about 5 months and just said, this is not a place that is conducive to anything right now. And honestly, I think what most of us should do is just not be here right now. So I was completely quiet. On the racial stuff, I did my very best to model quiet listening from respected Black leaders that are spiritual leaders in the field. So I would do podcast interviews, I just did one last week for Black History Month, a 2-hour long form interview with Jonathan Tremaine Thomas, who I think is one of the best voices in the kingdom of God right now on this. And just sit, listen, do what you're doing right now, but with people way smarter than me, just ask questions and kind of modeling that posture of listening and bringing in other people to speak and have a voice. And then when I would talk about politics, which I did, or racial stuff, I only did it in long form, so only did it in 45, 50-minute kind of sermons and lectures. And it's really interesting. A couple of my buddies, John Tyson and I, who are in these crazy progressive cities, who have done like really in-depth teaching on human sexuality, gender, transgenderism, LGBTQ stuff. People are like, do you just get like overwhelming hate mail and da da da? And the bizarre thing is we actually don't get anywhere close to what you would expect. And I think it's because, when you're dealing in mediums that are long form and thoughtful, and you're speaking in a way that doesn't even mean you're brilliant, but just is thought, you've clearly put time and effort and thought into it, and you have a posture of quietness and of compassion and kindness. It's even people that will completely disagree with you. You can't react to that in the same way that you do to a one-line tweet or an Instagram post with a hashtag and clickbaity kind of bad language or whatever, So I think for me, it's been mostly about being quiet. It's been about listening to leaders in those fields. And it's about trying to only talk in kind of relationally embodied long form mediums as much as possible.
Wow. How are you
Again,
seeing any success?
I'm not saying that I did anything well. I'm just telling you what I did.
No.
I have
John
no
Mark,
idea. I don't feel like I led great through the last year at all.
you are speaking my love language. One of the things I'm deeply concerned about is the death of conversation. And I have the advantage of age, where I remember when people used to have real conversations, and they were great, kind of like this, right? Where you listen and learn, and you get people with different perspectives in the place. And like you, I that's something I enjoy. Are you seeing, I want you to put your pastor hat on or your friendship hat on, but when you think about Gen Z, when you think about younger millennials, are you seeing any signs of hope or progress in being able to foster a deeper dialogue? And if so, what are those things that are helping you do that?
Well, I mean, I think the church is really poised well for this, because most of these conversations are had in the whether it's about politics or race or any number of things, they're had in the ideological digital space, not in the relational kind of embodied thoughtful space. And very different ways to have those conversations. You talk very differently to over a cup of coffee than you do on Twitter, if that makes sense, if that goes without saying. And people read cues, they're more gracious with each other as a general rule, they're more compassionate, they're more empathetic, they tend to, be less ideological. So I think the church is uniquely poised to actually model for the rest of the culture and actually hold hard conversations. Like, because we can get together, we can get a couple hundred of us in the room or however many in the room, and we can sit and we can have a conversation with two people that radically disagree, and we'll treat each other with kindness, and we can talk about it together. Like, that's becoming like increasingly you can't do that online. It's becoming increasingly impossible in the secular sphere because it's so ideologically captivated. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I do think that the church offers a unique kind of perspective going forward.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that? Like, we talked about pastoring ourselves, I think, which is such a needed subject right now. When you're pastoring your people, what has been helpful? Because they're triggered, they're traumatized, they are subject to the same things. What is helping you and your team help them?
Well, I'm really so I think one of the mistakes we can make, especially if you're a little bit more of a thinker kind of pastor, is you can just respond intellectually and ideologically to people's rhetoric. And that, I think, it just probably works one time out of 10. Most people even if they are sophisticated, intelligent kind of people, most of us are far more emotionally and relationally driven than we care to admit. And most of us are living with hurt. And most people right now are living with an extraordinary anxiety and grief. And anger is the emotion that is, they call it like the cover emotion, because it's the one where we feel safe. Anger is a self-protective emotion where we get mad and we get aggressive, really in an attempt to protect ourselves or to get what we want, but often to protect ourselves. So often behind anger is actually an extraordinary level of anxiety and sadness. And so I think if I can discipline myself to set aside some of the angry rhetoric and the amount of projection and transference that's coming to me, and help people attend to their anxiety and their grief, it just deflates a ton of that balloon. So we've been doing a ton at a pastoral level to just help people attend to their anxiety and pastor people through the stages of grief. Things like we're doing a daily 10-minute podcast that's basically a short meditation and then a contemplative prayer. Our Sunday gatherings, we're having longer times of quiet, stillness. In my preaching, I'm sitting on a stool right now. I'm talking slower right now. I'm experimenting a lot with my working theory that so far all of my experience has confirmed that emotional energy is not the same thing as spiritual power. And often preachers start ranting and raving and shouting and talking in heightened voices because they don't actually have powerful content and spiritual authority. And so I'm just more and more just trying to function. I mean, our elders reread Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman. I think that's a must read for every leader in this season. And just what does it look like to function as a non-anxious presence and to create spaces. I think the future of the church is literally the opposite of the hype, laser lights, rock and roll. I'm saying that's bad. I'm just saying I think church needs to become a haven for noise refugees who actually come in and find quiet places. We're doing morning worship right now. It's all socially distanced. You have to sign up and it's small, but like quietness, like 10 minutes of quiet, listening prayer, reading Psalms, an acoustic guitar, singing a few worship songs, like letting people just really process their pain and anxiety together and before God. And so I think lots of those kinds of pastoral mediums, however you do it based on your church and context and size and capacity, we're really looking for mediums to kind of help people attend to their anxiety, slow down, present before the peace of God, grieve together, and just kind of, suffer our way through with joy.
Oh, that makes me want to show up at your church tomorrow. It really does, John Mark. That's so refreshing. I think you're right. I think there's a significant pivot happening in the lights and the hazers and all that stuff from the past generation. And I've led one of those churches, but yeah, things are shifting and the church needs to be an alternative to culture, not an echo of it. I think particularly in this season. You've kind of half answered this, but final question for you. Bridgetown Church, how do you think it's going to be fundamentally different moving forward, or will it be?
Well, I mean, we're guessing at that level,
Yeah, because we don't know. We're not at the end. We're in the middle, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, of course, Portland is like kind of off the map as far as the aggression of secularism here, but this crisis has intensified what already was. And it has ratcheted up the ideological rhetoric on both the right and the left to 11, and tons of people in churches all across North America, and in particular in America, and on the right and on the left, I think just have been completely co-opted and swept away by various ideologies, from nationalism to all the things. And I do think the gift of this year is it's like persecution, and this isn't like full-on persecution, but if you look at church history or what's happening in Iran right now, or what persecution does is it makes the committed more committed, and it makes the people that are nominal, most of them, just disappear. And the people that are on the fence, it tends to push them either to disappear or to actually follow Jesus. So I think that what will emerge from our community on the backside is a just more like straight up, we're Orthodox Christian, historic Christians in this crazy progressive city, really robust discipleship to Jesus, really thick webs of community, because that's the only thing that I think will survive the coming secularism. And that's a good thing. I'm excited about that. And I think, and we didn't have a ton of this in Portland, but those nominal kind of Christians on the side will increasingly just disappear. I think we've lost a ton of them this year. So I don't know if our church will be bigger or smaller. I would imagine smaller. I don't know, because of the inner dynamics of Portland. But I think it's definitely a moment for me. Like we're in this really progressive city, and we're not a progressive church. Like I'm very Orthodox Christian, follower of Jesus. New Testament is authority. I'm not, and increasingly I'm not a conservative either, based on what that word has come to mean in America, at least. But I think for a long time we've kind of not tiptoed around, but we've really tried to nuance and no, we're thoughtful and we're kind and we're not angry, we're not, and I think hopefully all that's still true, but I think we've come to the spot now where we're just like, screw it. Like we're never going to placate, far left people or far right people. We're followers of Jesus. That's going to put us at odds with both sides. Let's follow Jesus together. And I do think that the future of the church is going to be based around rule of life. I think what doctrinal statements were to churches and denominationalism under Christendom, I think rules of life will be to churches in exile under secularism. I think the question will be, how do you live as a church? How are you doing community? What are the spiritual disciplines you're leaning into? How are you doing discipleship? These will be the questions of the future, not like, how much money did you raise for your new fog machine? Because a fog machine, I mean, again, I'm not slamming that. I'm just saying that is not going to help people stay faithful to Jesus in a Portland or wherever. I was like, and honestly, most people in my city are turned off by it. So again, that probably sound more critical than I actually am. I just think the future is going to be all around a table, robust discipleship, rule of life, courageous fidelity to orthodoxy, still Sunday gatherings, because they're actually really important in secular contexts, but like really just rigorous discipleship to Jesus.
Well, this is we're 3-hour podcast would be a real blessing, but this has been such a good dive almost into a pool of what's happening in your life, in your heart, as God works. I can't thank you enough on behalf of all the leaders who are listening, John Mark. So thank you so much for joining us.
Chat. Yeah, It's an honor. I'm so grateful for the work you do, and everyone at Barna. We're just recipients of your good work. I quoted Barna in my sermon yesterday. So very, very grateful. Your great stat on millennials. What was it? 3,000, I found my notes in front of me, 3,000 hours a year of digital content, 150 of which is Christian for the resilient disciples. So, or maybe I'm messing the stat up. So anyway,
no, I think that's right. I think that's right.
Grateful for the work that all of you do.
Thank you, John Mark. And for all of you who are listening today, thank you so much for joining us on Church Pulse Weekly. We are back next time with a fresh episode. You can check out everything, including the Hybrid Church Barna Collab. You can go to barna.com/collab. Use the coupon code ChurchPulse15 if you want a bit of a discount. And we just try to bring you conversations like this every